Sachas Gittin Daf Mem Beis continues the discussion of a person who is half Evet, half Ben Chayrin. The Gemara will have two primary sugyas. The first is a continuation of a discussion of machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim as to whether it's possible to set a person free halfway. The Gemara will discuss to what type of freedom that applies, have a kasha, and 4 answers. Then we'll get to the second sugya, which discusses what happens if a person like that is attacked by an ox that belongs to the master and related discussions. Let's begin. We've seen in the last half between Rebbe and the Chachamim whether it's possible to free half an Evet. If one owns an entire Evet, can he go ahead and set half the Evet free? Rebbe says yes, and the Chachamim say no. So now Rabba wants to qualify that machlokes. Rabba says that machlokes is only where he's trying to set half free and keep the other half. If, however, he's setting half free and the other half he's also divesting himself of either by selling it or giving it away as a gift to someone at the same time, so he is not having any part of the Evet left for himself, that everybody agrees he can do. That situation, even the Chachamim would agree that he could do that. And the reason is because the Chachamim only said he cannot keep half an Evet for himself and send half away, because it's learned out of a get isha. A get isha has to completely sever the bond between the woman and her husband. She can't be half divorced. Therefore, an Evet cannot be half removed from his possession. However, he could be removed in two different ways. It could be half set free and half sold or given as a gift. So that's what Rabbah says. And Abaye has a kasha. Abaye wants to show that even in a situation like that, there is a machlokes, and the Rabbanan would still hold that it doesn't work. And the way he's going to show that is by having a contradiction between two brises. He's going to say the only way to resolve it is to say that it's a machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim. The Gemara is going to answer by giving 4 other ways of explaining the brisa without making a machlokes Rebbe and the Chachamim. So what are the two? One's a Mishnah. What's the Mishnah and the brisa that seem to contradict each other? So they're both discussing somebody who gives over all of his estate, his entire possession, to 2 of his avadim, and therefore each one is kind of half of it, and each one thereby also acquires half of the other eved. The question is, does this work? And the contradiction is whether it works or not. So let's see the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says if somebody writes over all of his property to his 2 avadim and he gives it to them, the Gemara's assumption, the Gemara's understanding is that he gives it to them at the same time, the same exact moment, so that they each acquire even halves. So the first Mishnah, which we're quoting first, says it works. Each Eved acquires half the property, including half of the other Eved, and they each have to free each other. Now, the half of the other one that they own. Now, the Brisa now says that it does not work. This one says that he says, all my property is given to such and such my 2 avadim. Even themselves are not kleina. No one's kleina anything. It doesn't work. So now, a contradiction. Does something like that work or not? So Abai says it has to be machlokes Rebbe and the Chachamim, because what's happening is that he's giving each of them away half. He's giving half of each of them to themselves, which means he's freeing half of them. And freeing half, that's a machlokes between Rebbe and Chachamim. Rebbe holds it works, Chachamim hold it does not work. So the Mishnah would be Rebbe that it works. The Brisa would be Chachamim that it does not work. And here we're talking about where he's giving the entire thing away. He's giving half to set free, because he's giving the Evet half to himself, and the other half he's giving to the other Evet. So you see, in a case where it's all being divested, half by being set free and half by being given away, there is still a machlokes. That's what Abai wants to say. Now the Gemara responds by offering 4 other ways of explaining this without making it a machlokes Rebbe and Chacham. So the Gemara's first answer is to say that the first case, the Mishnah, where it says it works, is where he says he's giving away all his property to each of them. Each are being gifted with everything, and because they can't both own everything, it ends up being a split. And everybody agrees in a case like that it works, because he's giving half. You end up with half to one and half to the other, just like Rabba said. The Brisa, where it doesn't work, is where he said to the first one, I'm giving you half, and I said to the second one, I'm giving you half. So even though he said those 2 things at the same time, he didn't give it all away. He only gave a half. Each one was only giving of a half, and giving of a half does not work. So Marasa Kasha, you can't tell me that the Brisa is referring to where he gave half to one and half to the other, because the second half of the Brisa talks about that. The second half of the Brisa says that if he said half and half, it does not work. Now, the first half of the Brisa also said it doesn't work, but that must have been referring to a different case. Must have been talking about where he gave it all to each of them. So you see, you can't tell me that the Bryce is referring only to where it was half, because then what's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa? Someone says there's no difference between the Reisha and the Seifa. The Seifa is explaining the Reisha. The second half of the Bryce is explaining the reason why in the first half it doesn't work is because the first half is talking about where it was given away half to one and half to the other. Okay, so therefore it's not a problem. Now it says it's logically you have to learn it this way, because if you want to learn it your way, that the first half is saying that if he gives all away to if he gives all his property to each of them, it doesn't work. Why do you have to go further and tell me that if he gives half his property to each of them, it doesn't work? For sure it doesn't work. It doesn't work to give away all. It certainly doesn't work to give away half, because giving away half has the extra problem that you can't set an Eved halfway free. You can't give away half an Eved. So therefore it has to be, like I said, the second half of the Bryce is explaining the first half, explaining the reason why it doesn't work, because this entire Bryce is talking about where he gave away half and half, where he gave away all his property in halves. So that's not a proof. I could explain it simply. The reason that we had to say the second part of the Bryce is to show that the first part of the Bryce was talking about where he gave it all away. If not for the second half, we would only have the first half. We would think that the first half is talking about where he gave away half. Because giving away half and half, is more likely that it shouldn't work. So when the Bryce says that giving away all your property to your Avodim doesn't work, I might think that's talking about where he gave half to each. And therefore, we have to say the second case he gave half to each, it doesn't work, to show that the first case must have been where he gave the entire thing to each of them. And therefore, really, it's possible to learn, I'm not saying for sure, but it's possible to learn that the beginning, the first part of the Brisa is referring to where he gave away all his property each, and the second is referring to where he gave away half his property to each. Okay, this is the Gemara's first explanation of the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa, without saying that it's a machlokes between Rabbi and Chachamim. Now the Gemara gives another explanation. The Gemara says the difference is as follows: when he gave away the property, did he give it in one document or two documents? That is, did he give a separate gift document to each Eved, or did he give one document that says that his property is given to both of them? So the Mishnah, which says it works, is when he gave a separate document to each of them, because that's really the only way you're supposed to be able to do that. You have to give a separate document to each. If you write two gifts, which include the freedom of the Eved, into one document, it doesn't work. Just like a get for two women in one document doesn't work. Now, the second case, the Brisa, where we said it does not work, that's where he tried to use one document to give both of them away. So Gemara asks if that's true. So we just said before that the Brisa is referring to where he gave half and half. He gave half to one and half to the other. And it says that explicitly in the second part of the Brisa, which is explaining the first part of the Brisa. But why is it only if it's half and half? If he made a mistake of trying to give away two different gifts in one document, then that doesn't work no matter what he did. So why are we only discussing where he gave half to one and half to the other? Even if he gave all to one and all to the other, it shouldn't work. So Gemara says, you're right. In this answer, in this explanation of the contradiction between the Brisa and the Mishnah, we're not going to say that the entire Brisa is talking about where he gave half and half, and the second part is explaining the first part. We're going to say, no. We're going to say as follows. The first part is talking about where he gave everything away. The second part says that if he gave everything away in one shtar, it does not work. The second part says, and if he would have given it in two documents, it would work, as long as he gave it all away in each of them. He gave a full gift to each of them. If he did half and half, giving away half doesn't work, so it wouldn't work even if he used two separate documents. And that's how you would understand the Brisa. And that's why it would talk about two separate cases. It's not the Bryce is not talking about only half and half, and the second part is explaining the first part. It's talking about two cases. The first part is referring to where he gave it all away and to each of them, and the second part is referring to where he gave half away to each of them. And now that gives its third answer. So Gemara says that the Mishnah is referring to where he gave all his property at once. He gave it to both of them at once, and the simplest way to accomplish that is if he made a shliach to be zeicha in it on behalf of each of them. And therefore, they each get it completely at the same time. They each get an equal half. Since they each get an equal half, they are each kaina each other, and they have to share and have to split it, and it works. The second thing. The Brisa is referring to where he gave first one and then the other. And that's why it doesn't work. Now, the Gemara asks, why not? Why shouldn't it work? The Gemara says, I understand why the one that he gave second, it doesn't work, because he had already given everything over to the first one. And he was no longer the owner, so he can't give it to the second one. But why, when he gave it to the first one, shouldn't it work? If he gave everything to him first, it should work. So the Gemara therefore rejects this answer. The Gemara says this is not a good answer. Now, our fourth answer has a name. That's where Rav Ashi brings this one. And he says here, actually, in the Brisa, the problem is something else entirely. The problem is when he said, I'm giving over everything, he used the word avdai. He said, I'm giving it over to my avadim. In the Mishnah, he didn't say avdai. He said, I'm giving it over to you and you. In the second case, he said avdai. That means he seems to be thinking that he could give it over to them while retaining ownership of them as avadim. And that's something that you can't do, and therefore his entire transaction is void. It has nothing to do with giving half, giving whole. None of that has anything to do with this. So Gemara says on that, Rafa Masakasha to Rav Ashi. Now when he says Avda, he doesn't mean that they're staying my Avadim going forward. It just means those who were my Avadim up till now. And you have to say that way. I'm going to show you other places where a person gives things to Avadim that sets them free, and that we don't say there's a problem that he still seems to think that he's retaining ownership of the Avadim. So we have a Mishnah. It says somebody writes over all his property to his Eved, the Eved goes free, unless he leaves over some land. Then we assume since he left over some land, the Eved is also left out, and he doesn't go free. And Shimon says, no, he goes free in all situations until he says, everything is given over except for 1/10,000th of my property. We assume that that refers to the Eved himself. Now, so that's the only situation in which Shimon has an issue here, but if he doesn't say that, it works as long as he gives over the property. Now, what did he say? He said, I'm giving it over to my Eved. He called him an Eved. And we don't say, since he called him an Eved, he's trying to retain ownership and give a gift to his Eved, and which he can't do because he owns the Eved. So therefore, obviously, we interpret it when he said, I'm giving it over to my Eved, he meant to the one who was my Eved up till now, and now he was not going to be my Eved any longer, and therefore we shouldn't have a problem here. The Gemara now returns to our Mishnah to start our new sugya. In our Mishnah, we had seen somebody who is half free and half belongs to his master, so he serves himself one day, and he serves his master one day, and they switch off. Someone says, what if he gets gored by an ox? Who gets the money? Who collects the payment for the damages that happened to him? Is it himself, or is it his master? So Gemara says, it depends who he was working for the time that he got the gored. Whose day was it? If it was his own day, he collects. If it was his master's day, his master collects. So where it says that means to say that he switches from being an Eved to a Ben Chayrin. He switches from being owned by himself to being owned by his master as the day switches. If that's true, so then on the day that he belongs to himself, he should be allowed to marry a Bas Chayrin. On the day that he belongs to the master, he should be allowed to marry a Shivcha because he has those halachos. Gemara says, no, he doesn't change in Isser. He changed in monetary value. He changed in monetary issues. As far as who he belongs to monetarily, his halachic status of Eved doesn't change. He has the status of being half an Eved and half a Ben Chayr. Right now the Gemara tries to bring a proof from a Brisa. The Brisa says, if the ox kills a ox who's a Shor Hamud, kills an Eved who is half Eved and half Ben Chayrin. So the halacha is, if you be an Eved, he has to pay a fine of 30 selah to the owner. If you be a Ben Chayrin, then the owner of the ox has to pay the full value of the person to the inheritors. So the question is, what happens here? So this Brisa says, so he gives half the knas to the master and half the kaifer to the inheritors as a Ben Chayrin. That means we say, and we talk to the master, we say you lost an Eved, so you get knas, but you only owned half the Eved, so you get half the knas. And we talk to the Yorshim, we say you lost your father, and he was a Ben Chayrin, but he was only half a Ben Chayrin, so you only get half kaifer. So the Gemara's kasha is, why do we do that? Why do we split it like that? Why don't we say it depends whose day it was? Just like we said, if he has damage altogether. So the Gemara answers is a concept called kal yikarna, which is when a damage is caused and it completely destroys the thing down to the root, or in this case, where you kill the person, where you do not divide it that way. The only case in which you split it is where there was an injury which is going to be restored, such as if he was struck in the arm withered, but is going to get healed. That's not kal yikarna, and therefore you can have what's there, and there is what to split. So Gemara says akasha here. This makes sense according to Abai. It doesn't make sense according to Rava, based on a machlekes how you treat the damages that a person suffers when he's injured by being struck by another human. According to Abai, there's two separate things. There's sheves and there's nezek. Nezek is how much his price on the market is devalued if he would be sold as an eved, and that's based on what work he's able to do. Sheves is even after you've devalued him to a job that he can still do, even that job for a while he can't do because he's in bed recovering. So that's how much he has to lose for that. According to Rava, you don't have two separate things here. You just have sheves, and that sheves is how much he doesn't work, and that's evaluated based on what his job was before the injury. So the problem is like this. The problem is that a cow doesn't pay sheves. A cow only pays nezek. There's no din of sheves on a cow. There's no din of lost work time on a cow. There's only a din of the damages. So according to Abaye, there's nezek here. But according to Rava, there's no nezek. So how can we even talk about nezek? How can we even talk about the cow having to pay stuff, at least the owner of the cow having to pay stuff, if you only have sheves, and sheves is something that the cow is not chayiv? So the Gemara wants to give two answers. The Gemara first says either he was hit by a person, not a cow. We're not really referring to where he was hit by an animal, or Rava doesn't hold of this entire thing. This entire sugi here it's not a price or a mishnah. It's a memra. It's said by Habarim, and Rava will disagree with the entire thing. Gemara now starts a new sugi. The Gemara introduces a shaila, which the Gemara wants to try to resolve from our mishnah. Shaila is, in all the cases which we said where somebody goes free, but his master has to give him get shechur, what happens if he's attacked and killed then? Does the master get knas or not? So, for example, we said somebody who the master is mafkim or makdishim, or even a half eved, half ben choron, where he is half freed, where we said we forced the master to free the rest of him. That was the psak of Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel at first didn't want to say that way, and then Beis Hillel agreed. So in all those situations, he's free, but he's still an eved in halachic status and requires to get shechur. So what happens if there's knas that's owed? Does the master receive it or someone else? Or no one? So is he called the master? On the one hand, he's not called the master. And he doesn't own him anymore. On the other hand, he still is a bit of the master because he still has to free him. So what do we do? So the Gemara wants to try to bring a proof. We said in the recipe just quoted, if somebody kills, if an ox kills a half eved, half ben chayrin, he has to give half knas to the half owner, and he has to give half kaifer, that is the value, to the half of the inheritors for the ben chayrin side. So why is he giving half knas to the owner? Probably we're referring to where Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai, and he's already forced to free him. And still we see giving the knas to the owner, obviously he still has the halachic status of the owner and gets knas. In this case, it's half knas because he only owns half him. So says, no, we're talking about before Beis Hillel agreed, and you don't force to free, and that's why he has to give it. But if you would force him to free, then maybe you wouldn't have to give. Okay, the Gemara quotes another brisa. The brisa says if you knock out, if a owner of an eved Kanani knocks out his tooth and then blinds his eye. So the halacha is, for either of these things, he goes free. So once his tooth is knocked out, he goes free. Now he's a free man. He has to pay him for the eye. Now, if you would say that when he goes free, but he still requires to get shechur, which is what happened after he knocked out the tooth, so then the eye payment goes to the master. So why should the eye, who's he going to pay for the eye? He's going to pay himself for the eye? That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, then the master doesn't receive the knas once he is set free, even though he still requires to get shechur. So Gemara says, no, maybe this brisa is holding that he doesn't require to get shechur at all in a situation like that when he's hit. And then he goes free and he's free fully, he's not an eved anymore, and doesn't require to get shechur. And when Gemara quotes the brisa that quotes this machlokes to whether or not situation like this he requires a get shechur, the brisa says in all these losses of limbs, any loss of any of the 24 limbs, the eved goes free. According to Tanakama, requires a get shechur. Rabbi Shmuel says he requires a get shechur. Rameir says he does not. Rabbi Elazar says he does. Rabbi Tarfon says he does not. Rabbi Kiva says he does require a get shechur. And then we have the machrin, those who decide before the Chachamim, they say the halacha is like Rabbi Tarfon about the tooth and the eye, because the Torah specifically says so. And it's like Rabbi Kiva about all the other limbs, because it's just a knas of the Chachamim. Versus knas, it's a fine of the Chachamim. It's not a fine of the Chachamim. It's right in the Psukim. So since it's a drasha of the Chachamim, it's not specifically mentioned, therefore you wouldn't be zoche in those. The Gemara now has another similar shayla. What happens if someone is in a similar situation? He's gone free, but he still requires to get shechur. If his master was a kohen, can he eat truma? An eved eats truma through the schus of his master, but here he's kind of free. The Torah says as the rights to eat truma comes from being a kinyan kasboi, a monetary possession. So he's not really a monetary possession, but perhaps the fact that he's still owed to get shechur still gives him the halachic status of a monetary possession. So Mara wants to bring a proof. Malacha Ramashashi says if you have a kohenes and her shivcha who give birth and they mix up which kid is which. So you have two kids growing up. One of them is a free kohen and one is a shivcha, one is an eved of a kohen. You don't know which one is which. So the halacha is that they both could eat truma. The son of a kohen as well as the eved of a kohen eat truma, so that's no problem. The thing is, they cannot be awarded truma unless they're both there, because the halacha is an eved can't get truma unless his master is with him, unless he claim that from the fact that he's receiving truma that he's a regular kohen, he's a ben chayrin. You have to have your eved with him. Now, once they grow up, they free each other, and that way it doesn't matter who's who. So Gemara asks, how come they're allowed to receive truma if they have to be freed? Obviously, the fact you have to be freed and you're still waiting for the get shechur, you're still allowed to eat truma. So one says, no, this is very different. Here, if Eliyahu Navi would come and he would tell us who's who, we wouldn't have to force anybody to be freed. The one who's being freed doesn't have a halachic status of being forced to be freed. We just don't know who's who. That's why we have to free them. And this is not a situation where he is considered to be freed and is just waiting for